Misappropriation of the sacred. I'm going to present 4 projects, all emerging from Europe during the period between the start of World War I and the start of World War II. On the left, drawings of 3 of them, shown at the same scale. On the right, a photograph of the 4th. These projects offer a range of responses to a singular historical circumstance. What holds them together is that they were all conceived in response to the destruction of World War I, whether as immediate reactions to its violence or in calculated exploitation of its longer-term effects of isolation, distrust, and resentment. Those words, isolation, distrust, and resentment, are again familiar to us today, not only, but also in the wake of the pandemic. For better and worse, these were spaces that sought in their own ways to address division, to foster unity, and to establish what can only be described as new patterns of communion. Each of them drew heavily on the architectural vocabularies of religious encounter. As realistic proposals, 3 of these schemes were conspicuously unsuccessful. One was disastrously effective. I'm going to speak briefly about each of these, and then I'll end on why I think they're worth paying attention to today. In 1915, the Dutch architect Hendrik Petrus Berlage, often described as the father of Dutch modernism, proposed a monument to the nations, conceived in the throes of World War I as a statement of international reconciliation and unity. Designed to overlook an unspecified plain, it forms the processional focus of 8 military roads that converge from every direction of the compass, but lead the nations not toward conflict, but to an octagonal pantheon of humanity. This is really a contradiction of terms. This pantheon is devoted not to all the gods, but to mankind. And it's explicitly non-religious, dedicated to Europe's war dead. It's centered about a monument of human unity and topped by a dome of international community. All its parts are intended to convey meaning, not least 8 light-emitting towers representing a series of abstractions: love and courage, enthusiasm and prudence, knowledge and power, freedom and peace. Nationalistic sentiment has been evicted in favor of the most generous conception of international friendship. This project caught the attention of the German architect Bruno Taut, arguably the leading architectural thinker of his generation. Taut was deeply interested in architecture's capacity to bring communities together, and he published the project in his 1919 Stadtkrone, or City Crown, a book about the search for contemporary architecture that might be able to gather the community, providing a center in an increasingly fragmented world. But to Taut, Berlage's proposal is inadequate, particularly when compared, say, to the towering temples of Southeast Asia or the great historic cathedrals of Europe. In the absence of an authentic iconographic tradition, the intended attachment of abstract meaning to architectural form is ineffective. I quote, "You cannot just take a building and decorate it with symbolic markings. Those symbols must first become common property through established philosophical and religious practice." Absent this common ground, the fate of such a monument is not mutual understanding, but confusion. One reference was admittedly clear, also to others among Berlage's critics. Like Taut, Frederik van Eden, a Dutch reformer, complained of the absence of spiritual content, but he went on to draw a more pointed comparison. Ultimately, he declared, I quote, "The building is intended for the glorification of humanity, not for the glory of God. Its high towers are too proud, like the Tower of Babel." End quote. To substitute the human for the divine, he insists, is an exercise doomed to failure. Now, Bellach himself was not unwilling to appropriate, or perhaps misappropriate, biblical references. The booklet in which he published his monument quotes a famous passage from the book of Micah. "They shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore." But it omits, not insignificantly, the immediately preceding text, which asserts that it is the God of Israel who will bring about this international reconciliation. I won't read this out, but you can glance at it for yourself. The prophet's vision is precisely not one that is stripped of religious content. While he too speaks of an architecture that will provide a point of convergence for the nations, the symbolism of that architecture is very specific, perhaps too specific for Bellach's purposes. It's the architecture of Zion, described both as a tower and as the mountain or temple of the Lord's house. This temple tower, the highest of the mountains, stands in contrast with another, the Tower of Babel, a structure presented by the biblical text as a project for human unity, conceived in forgetfulness of the God of its earlier chapters. The prophet Micah, in contrast, is emphatically not prone to such forgetfulness. "For all the peoples walk each in the name of its God, but we will walk in the name of the Lord our God." Bellach's design can be compared to a still more ambitious post-war project developed by Van Eyden himself in collaboration with Dutch architect Jaap London. Its plan is similar to Bellach's, albeit at a vastly larger scale. Its architecture presents a curious mix of garden city planning and broadly Babylonian massing. As a design for a world city, it too was a reaction to the war, and it was advertised through a dedicated publication entitled Het Godshuis in de Lichtstad, the House of God in the City of Light. Its language resounds with the epiphanic vocabulary of expressionism, but its origins are more obscure. It was conceived, according to Van Eyden's diary, during a series of seances. Unsurprisingly, the city's layout pays attention to spiritual interests. Its concentric arrangement devotes space to the demands of body, mind, and soul. Commercial interests are relegated to an outer ring. A middle ring accommodates artistic, cultural, institutional programs. In explicit acknowledgement of the fate of Babel, a prominent site is earmarked for an academic library of language and literature, so as to preclude misunderstanding through linguistic discipline. And an inner ring is devoted to a distinctly pluralist religious sensibility. Various creeds are represented in what is described as a holy circle or crown. In an uncomfortable compromise between the abstract conceptions of geometry and the more concrete demands of architectural typology, the main arms of a hooked cross are devoted to four of the world's major traditions, Western and Eastern, with minority interests relegated to the wings, described as swastika arms. The technicalities of this arrangement receive less attention, but the reader is told that within this sacred space, Buddhist will speak with Christian, Protestant with Catholic, each constrained by architectural opportunity to appreciate the good and the beautiful in each other's faith. At the crossing, under a dome of religious unity, stands the central house of God, the cathedral of brotherhood. Stripped, again, of any religious specificity, it is to become the temple of the searching human soul. Van Eden's premises differ from Berlache's, but the architectural conclusions are strikingly similar and curiously vacant. Van Eden made repeated efforts to communicate his plan to the President of America, to Henry Ford, and so forth, but his vision remained unbuilt, as did Berlache's monument to the nations. But an unhappy memory was perpetuated in the towers of Johannes and Walter Krüger's Tannenberg monument, a nationalistic memorial to Germany's war dead, built in East Prussia in 1927, and later appropriated by Hitler for propagandistic purposes as a monument to German pride, a sacred shrine, and a place of national pilgrimage. With a few adjustments, the architecture proved readily adaptable to this purpose. Hitler's attentions guaranteed the structure's later ruin. Nothing remains today. Its octagonal form is now best seen from above as a rough outline traced across the surface of an otherwise deserted site. But this unprepossessing present betrays a spectacular past. The memorial's moment of greatest fame came in 1934 at the funeral ceremony for Field Marshal von Hindenburg, an immaculately choreographed production designed by Albert Speer using techniques subsequently developed at Nuremberg's Nazi party rally grounds, celebrated in military splendor with Hitler in attendance. After a silent, torch-lit procession, the soldiers assembled within the enclosure of the monument's towers sang in patriotic unison the hymn, a mighty fortress is our God. This too represented a misappropriation of the sacred, albeit in the domain of music. It's easy for us, I think, to feel a certain sympathy for Berlache and Van Eden. They were well-meaning. They sought to use architecture to advance the cause of peace, unity, reconciliation, and so forth. This is obviously not true when we turn to Speer. And yet, if we return to this array, it's clear that Speer's 1939 project for a Berlin Volkshalle, a people's hall, is doing something that's architecturally not altogether dissimilar. It's ostensibly in the business of bringing the people together around a common, prosperous future, around a cause that's larger than themselves, that promises to erase the shame of the past. In a building that speaks explicitly of the history of temple architecture beneath the great dome of the heavens, and so forth. Speer himself observed in 1971 that Hitler compared the role of this sacred shrine within National Socialism to the role of St. Peter's within Roman Catholicism. According to Speer, it was modeled after the Pantheon. Hitler had visited Rome in 1938, but the Pantheon had been a long-time interest of his, described as a Monsterbau, the equivalent of 72 stories tall. This was to be the architectural centerpiece of the new world capital, its city crown. To give a sense of scale, the dome of St. Peter's could apparently have been lowered through its oculus. Incidentally, this also gives us a sense of the scale of these other schemes. The resemblance to the Pantheon in Rome is especially clear on the interior. Speer was explicit in describing this as a temple intended for public worship of the Führer. In a niche beneath another Roman eagle would be found not the image of a god, but rather the figure of Adolf Hitler, standing to address a crowd of 180,000 assembled beneath the coffered dome. And at this point, we would do well to remember that the original purpose of the Pantheon itself was precisely to serve as a dynastic temple for an imperial ruler cult. In this instance, I'm not sure that it makes sense to speak of architectural misappropriation. Which brings us to the climax, the architectural climax of Speer's career, perhaps the clearest articulation of National Socialism's architectural aspirations. And we're moving here from temple to cathedral, from classical to Gothic. This is his so-called Cathedral of Light, Lichtdom, for the Nuremberg Zeppelinfeld, a space designed to nurture the public ceremonies of the Nazi Party during the years leading up to World War II. A 1937 issue of the journal Der Baumeister, the architect, documents a speech by Hitler, immediately followed by a report on progress at Nuremberg. I quote, "The execution of a great project requires not only a great architect, but also a strong-willed client, and not least, an age possessed of the power and capacity to prepare the spiritual ground in which such a great structure can take root." In the year 1934, the Führer commissioned the architect Speer to establish a master plan for the Nazi Party rally grounds in Nuremberg. The familiar photographs showing the faithful congregated in a conscious display of unity and strength are among the more memorable images to have survived the collapse of the Third Reich. They reinforce to a fault architecture's capacity, to quote the novelist Joseph Ponton, to evoke the highest awe-struck astonishment in the presence of greatness. The Zeppelinfeld also fulfilled architecture's more basic functions. I quote again, "Enclosing the space with the ramparts of bleachers and with the main grandstand not only enables the participation of a larger mass of spectators, it also closes out the surroundings." Yet this perimeter was not the site's defining boundary. It was not the expression of sheer mass that constituted its most forceful effect. The towers on the ramparts were there merely to provide the base for a more ambitious structure. I quote, "From the very start of his tenure as designer of the party's mass rallies, Speer was clear that in this instance he could not settle for stone. Here, for the first time at this scale, the designer brought a further material into service." End quote. The more insistent architecture, the more real and enduring memory, was constructed by the careful placement of a large share of the nation's anti-aircraft searchlights, each one precisely calibrated to create what was simultaneously an enclosing perimeter and a defining tower of infinite proportions fading out into the night sky. The most compelling view could best be appreciated in an attitude of upward contemplation, as its architect later explained in his own carefully crafted memoir. I quote, "Placed around the field at intervals of only 12 meters, the 130 sharply defined beams remained visible to a height of 6 to 8 kilometers before they blurred into a single luminous surface. They gave the impression of a vast space, with individual beams forming the mighty pillars of infinitely high exterior walls. Occasionally a cloud would pass through the corona of light, adding to its magnificence an element of surreal illusion. I presume that this cathedral of light constitutes the first light architecture of its kind." For me, it remains not only my most beautiful creation, but the only one that in its own fashion has survived the test of time. End quote. This cathedral of light, the Lichtdom, is described by contemporary observers as an überwältigende Glaubensbekenntnis, an overwhelming confession of faith, articulating the experience of standing in that space and amid mounting tension. The account in Der Baumeister continues, and then the image freezes. The crowd falls silent. A clear light outlines the masses in sharp definition. The haze has lifted from the field. All around, the vertical beams of the searchlights trace sharply cut upward lines. That field is no longer merely a piece of earth. It is a space in a vast cathedral of light, its dome vaulted high up into the darkness of the night sky. The people are cut off from all earthly heaviness. Here they are all part of a great community, part of an experience that is greater than them. All are focused on a single point to which all eyes, all hearts are turned. All have become a part of this power standing there, a small dot on the grandstand, brighter than everything else, the center point of this great spectacle of light. There he stands. The comparison to the sacred is explicit, articulated by participants, by the patron, by the architect. Hitler insisted that the closing ceremony at Nuremberg possess all the solemnity of a Catholic Mass. To quote Speer, it was a fantastical experience like being in a Gothic cathedral. What are we to make of all of this? Each of these designs drew directly on the vocabularies of religious encounter, albeit vacated of conventional dogmatic formulations. In other words, they appropriated distinctive features of sacred spaces without subscribing to the underlying historical commitments that gave those spaces meaning and that constrained them within established boundaries. And if the first two of these aimed to articulate visions of peace and reconciliation, the second pair had altogether different goals. Yet they too were demonstrably designed to generate experiences that can only be described as spiritual in character. Theirs was a surrogate spirituality, to be sure, but it was by all accounts strikingly powerful and staggeringly effective. Even international visitors to Nuremberg reported the same overwhelming experience. This surrogate spirituality, wielded by architects who were professionally accomplished and highly skilled, sought to strengthen bonds of unity, not only between individuals, but across society more broadly. And it sought to establish new patterns of ritual and communion, new narratives that are nothing if not religious in their ambitions, invoking commitments to a newly established authority. But those narratives were fundamentally destructive. I would argue that these schemes serve as a reminder of the precarious relationship between architectural form and spiritual content. We would do well to question the legitimate boundaries of architecture's adoption of the forms of the sacred. Now, this paper emerges in part from the material of a recently published book that focuses especially on the run-up to World War II. But while its focus is firmly historical, its implications extend to the present, recognizing the world is again entering a phase when religious forms are being appropriated for ends that are not always redemptive, when the vocabularies of spiritual renewal are subject to abuse, when even the suffering of the global pandemic has been exploited for political gain. As architects, we cannot ultimately avoid the confrontation with an inconvenient truth that the available patterns of communion are not all equally constructive. What distinguishes true communion from its false counterparts, or the holy from the unholy? Now, a 20-minute talk does not lend itself to answering these questions. But I do want to suggest that those of us who are invested in the future of architecture need to take them seriously. We need to wrestle with that relationship between form and content, and we also need to be willing, and I'm conscious that this is more difficult, to contradict the misappropriation of the sacred.